Well, welcome, friends. It's great to see so many friends over here and so many Marg subscribers all together who've come to be able to support us in this venture. I'm Naman Ahuja. I'm professor of art history at JNU, and I'm also the general editor of Marg. And Marg is a not-for-profit organization that was set up in 1946 and comes up with a quarterly journal which is dedicated to South Asian culture studies and natural history and environment. We've been, over the years, bringing out volumes that are more in the nature of looking at an area or a culture as a whole, rather than focusing only on looking at a narrow element in isolation. Situating an object within a region, along with all the other social dynamics that work around it, makes one takes a very broad and anthropological view at art history or at culture studies. And that has been something that we have always endeavored to do. Our guest editors, which in this case we're here to talk about a fantastic volume called Tents, Cities on the Move. The cover photograph is rather unusual. People said that, what's this fashion magazine with these Swarovski crystals that you've put on the cover? And of course they're not. It's an aerial photograph of a tented encampment, which is in Bangladesh, and you have to zoom in to be able to see all the millions of people roaming around in between these tented encampments. Was guest edited by Rahul Mehrotra, who's sitting here with me, who's also on Marg's editorial board and has been associated with Marg for many years. Rahul is the founder of RMA Architects and the John T. Dunlop Professor in Housing and Urbanization at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard. And many of us know his fantastic buildings all over the subcontinent and indeed in other parts of the world. But he's as prolific as a writer and as a thinker. And it's been fantastic to be able to collaborate with him on bringing out this particular volume of Marg, because we could really collaborate on a million things, and it was a privilege to be able to have a sensitive compatriot working on aspects of design where the thinking that went into positioning pictures and placing things where they are could actually be a very synergistic equation. So thank you very much. My talk today is really focused on introducing you to this volume and why we did what we did. If I can get it to start. Here we are. Okay. And can we put the lights off? Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Okay. So of course, Marg is brought out in a large folio size, and condensing the pages and for you to be able to see them over here might be a bit difficult. Some of you, if you'd like to come in the front and sit down, there's some space here. If somebody doesn't mind sitting on the floor, there are spaces here, rather than all crowding up at the back. Okay, so we have great fun while doing it. As onerous as the design can be, it's also great fun. And as you can see, we designed the text to follow the arc on the line of tents and the ropes that make up tents and tie tents together. And we had our fun moments while making it. It's been a sort of an interesting galaxy of people who came together to contribute to this particular volume. And although you can't probably read from where you are the list of people who contributed to it, I really want to also particularly thank Sylvia Hotling for the work that she did in helping us with this particular volume and thinking through it, because she brought a lot of her scholarship on textiles from the Mughal and Deccani courts to bear. Julian Jain wrote a fantastically technical piece to really get into the nitty-gritty of how tents actually are tied together and what are the actual components that make a tent up. I would urge you, for those of you who want to know how this is done historically, to be able to look at his piece on that. Dinesh Mehta was somebody who collaborated a lot with Rahul, and Rahul will mention his documentation of the Kumbh. I also want to mention that when we start thinking about tents and mobility, which is one of the key features of how we need to think about urbanization afresh in a volume like this, we also need to think about India's own history of vernacular architecture apart from tents, which is the kind of ephemeral building that goes on when it comes to the construction of a pandal. Although they are not always, strictly speaking, tents, they do use some of the same principles of tensile architecture, and they do use bamboo and sarkanda in very interesting ways. And so I think that deserved inclusion. And there are two studies in here. One of the major Sarvodaya exhibition, which was the first major Gandhian exhibition that happened on the expo scale over millions of square feet of space in 1947-48, which was the first one in memory of Gandhiji that was held in 1948 in Jaipur. So we have the documentation of that. And we have Tapati Guha Thakurta, who's given us an essay here on her seminal work on the Durga Puja pandals, which has been preceded over here. And then we end with some work that was done by contemporary artists who are working in the field and looking at these materials, and we're seeing how they're interpreting it. So Rahul will talk more about that. But for all of us, I think we should understand that how much civilizational history is really caught up with the idea of this ephemeral kind of building like a tent. So, of course, the Kumbh Mela is something which is a signature on this front, and Rahul will talk about that in more detail. It comes up every 12 years. It's a tented city for millions of people. The kind of logistics that is involved in making something like this is something that he will talk about, and the kind of organization. But we need to go back in history. And tents remained important for the many migratory communities of the world: the Mongols, the Rabadis, the Banjaras, the Bedouin, all the way up until the 20th century. So such a migratory sense brings an acceptance that home, and along with home, therefore, your sense of identity and your sense of belonging have to be established afresh, because you're mobile. You make a new home every time you go. So if we oftentimes theoretically fall into the trap of thinking of ourselves as belonging to in India. Really? So do caste kinships, linguistic bonds, are these the kind of cultural memories that are equally important rather than your geographical mooring? Because if you are a cluster of people who come from different migratory communities who happen to settle together within a single geography at a certain moment in time, how do we think about that? How do we think about that commingling that takes place because of the coming together at a certain moment in our lives when our lives intersect? And how do they intersect? What should we do with spaces like this? So I'll come back to this point repeatedly. How do we know what we know about the history of this kind of building? Military tents is one way we can find out a lot, because there are courtly records. There are treasuries and court records that have maintained detailed inventories of the kind of encampments that went from place to place. Now, if you think about something very simple, all of you who read your Asterix comics, and think about the time when the Roman legion went from location to location and went from place to place, taking ideas with them and languages with them, posted 2000 years ago, one garrison is, or one battalion is posted in Syria, and then they move to Tunisia, and then they move to Hadrian's Wall, and they are taking those ideas and movements with them. They're taking diseases with them. They're taking languages with them. They're taking all kinds of stories that go from location to location, and that's institutionalized mobility through an army. And we have records, therefore, to be able to tell the histories of this kind of mobile dwelling and how such mobile dwellings are to be constructed and reconstructed. Then we think about entertainment. So much of our living culture, when we think about the idea of a circus, the very word kirkos, the Greek word, comes out of the circular encampment of this mobile construction. And Astha Gandhi, who did her PhD on mobile colonial circuses, gave us lots of fascinating insights into not just the characters who worked in those circuses, but how those circuses were constructed and reconstructed. And we got some fantastic information and graphics here about different viceroys of India sponsoring circuses to be able to please the public and so on. But this kind of idea of mobile architecture is for entertainment is something which is still around. It's not just theater and circus, but it's also because of the idea of mobile cinema. Generator sets are put onto trucks and tractors, and all over rural Maharashtra particularly, and in many other places, entire cinemas and melas are created where people congregate, as you can see in these pictures, to see in these photographs, to see these, to see their cinema. Now, how do we know what we know architecturally about the tented enclosure? And one of the key things that anthropologists have studied and textile historians have studied have been the tents of Arabia, the Bedouin tents, on which there have been very detailed studies which have given us the kind of tented enclosures that could be made for elite people as well as for the common people, and the kind of interrelationships that fostered with the homestead, the animals that migrated with the community, and how they adapted the tents and the structure of the tents to the vagaries of the weather. And the studies on Bedouin tents are not limited to what happens in the Maghreb and in Arabia, but also extends to what we know about Central Asian tents, to Mongolian tents, and as well as to Turkish and then to Venetian tents. So the history of a lot of what we know about European tentage and Central Asian and Mongol tentage is very intrinsically located with the history of what we know about Middle Eastern tents, which is why we did a little bit of homework and precede some of that writing and research on these tents and included it in here in a few pages. But lest you all imagine that this is a thoroughly leftist way of thinking of the world, and that how wonderful that this is a sense of such migratory community and living outside national borders and internationalism and all the rest of it, Monisha Ahmed's study in this volume really para by para dealt with really important ideas that deconstructed this notion. And she says that how even nomadic communities have a fixed sense of which pasture lands they can occupy in which season, and these are generationally passed on rights of pasture and routes of travel from location to location, not limited to, not this idea that anyone can come and live on that riverbank whenever they want to at any time. So this is quite interesting, that there is a hereditary passing on of rights of where you can pitch your tent and what tents you can put where. So that's another thing to look at. I'm sorry there are no more chairs. Okay. As I was saying, Julian Jain wrote a study about Mongolian tents, which are instrumental for us to study because they give us the ancestry of a lot of what ideas the Mughals were bringing with them when they moved from Central Asia. Now, the Mughals and the Seljuks interacted, and those ideas migrate into India and have a huge impact on Rajput sensibilities. And that's what I'm going to talk about. So here you see an actual tent, and next to it, a yurt, and next to it you see a depiction of one, and you see the construction in the miniature painting, which is in the LA County Museum, which shows Alan Kwa, the fabled Mongol queen, talking to her sons from a page in the Akbarnama. And you can see that the door to the tent is lifted, and you can see the bamboo construction inside. And that's exactly the kind of construction technique that Julian's essay will then explain in the volume. Now, my own work for this volume was really concerned with how these tented encampments were a symbol of the mobility of culture. So from the Babarnama, for instance, there is this particular painting where Babur wanted to entertain the governor of Kohat as he is migrating in from Central Asia, and he's come into the northwest frontier, and he needs to make equations and solidarities with all the local governors from location to location as he moves into Hindustan. And there is a feast being prepared for the governor of Kohat. And it's a rather interesting feast being made. Animals are being skinned and they're being barbecued and all of that, which you can see in the painting. But there is also a special enclosure which is being prepared, which is distinct, which is the royal enclosure, which happens to be red in color. And all the other enclosures in the tented encampment are in different colors. So the royal enclosure being of red color is something quite important, and the earliest records of that come to us from Seljuk history texts, which tell us that by the 12th century, the idea of the royal enclosure being the red enclosure becomes something that is fixed. And in fact, these tents became so important that one of Timur's princesses was inherited a massive tent in her dowry. So tents were so important that they were parts of royal treasuries and royal dowry as negotiations that would happen, because it's like giving somebody not just a house, but you're giving somebody a mobile city. So it's quite a major gift that went with somebody in their marriage. So with that mobility comes the mobility of languages and histories. And that leaves both the community that is moving, transformed, as well as the community that they come into contact with, forever changed. This is what we wanted to really try and show, and we borrowed one particular tented panel which lies in the National Museum, which you can see on display over here at the CSMVS Museum in Mumbai. And we used it for an exhibition called India and the World, because I wanted to, in the curatorial concept, talk about how courtly etiquette and courtly culture is something that migrates from location to location. And so you see a particular red tented panel in the background. This particular tented panel, we now know 16 examples of this particular panel scattered in different museums all over the world and in a couple of private collections too. And these panels became the subject of my detailed research. The panels are kept in, they were found in the Tosha Khana of Jaipur, of the Royal Collection of Jaipur. Now the Tosha Khana is very strange as a place of discovery for this, because the Tosha Khana is where the honors, the state gifts are kept. It's not the textile store. It's where the state gifts are kept. And this was obviously something where the state gifts are, it's in the inventory list of the state gifts of Jaipur. And, things are kept in the Farash Khana normally, but here this comes from particularly is quite interesting, the catalogs of the inventories. Now, the panels come in 3 different sizes. Some of them are 2.6 meters high. Those are the tallest ones. And then there are some which are shorter. But even the shortest one is of a height which is higher than it would be of a man on horseback. And that's quite an important wall height, if you think about it. Because when you're thinking about people moving around the tented enclosure, they're not walking on foot. So if you're thinking about a ceiling height for people not to peer in and look over, you're thinking of a wall height which should be of the height of a person on horseback. And that's what determines your structure and line of vision, the height of your vision, your angle of vision. So that was architecturally significant. We looked at the depictions, I looked at the depictions of these things, of these kinds of tented cities through artwork that was going to be able to help me date how these tented enclosures changed in the imagination. And looking at it in Sultanate painting and then into the Hamzanama and then into Akbari painting, but finally coming into Rajput painting was extremely important to also be able to study not just the history of how the tent itself changes, but how interior designs of these tented cities, these tented rooms changed. And so we can also tell a history of the shift in interior design by looking at the paintings and correlating it with the actual textiles that we get. The reason why these tents become valuable to study also is because for more than 50%, or rather even 60% of the time of the Mughals, every Mughal emperor actually spent that time not living in the grand forts that they built of Agra or the Red Fort in Delhi or Lahore. The Mughals may have been great builders of these forts, but they really didn't live in them. For 60% of their lives, they lived in these tents. And we actually have precise data that people have calculated of how much of Akbar's reign was actually spent in tents versus the palaces that he constructed. And by the time we look at Aurangzeb's reign, Aurangzeb spent most of his life living in tents rather than living in any of the palaces he inherited. So we have to think about the importance of these tents much more in terms of the history of Mughal architecture, rather than looking at just Mughal architecture in the stone buildings. And if they're spending so much time in these tents, then we have to also think about social hierarchies. So royal enclosure, stables, doctors, bazaar, courtesans' quarter, etc., all the things that make up a city. Now, this is a city that's on the move. And what's very interesting is that we have precise records that Abul Fazl leaves in the Ain, in which he says that how there would be 1,000 men are needed to be able to erect a tent. And the emperor spends no more than a week in a particular tented township. And so there's a second tented enclosure, which lies wrapped up, which is sent on 100 elephants, 1,000 camels, so many thousand horses in advance to the next city, to the next place where the encampment is going to be created. When he decamps from one and the entire entourage moves to the next city which has been created, this one is wrapped up and sent to the next city where he will be 2 weeks later. So, or a week later, rather. So this entire process, one lot of people have to pack this one up, pack it, and move to the next location. And so the person who is in charge of all of the tents has the rank of a governor in the administration, because it is such an important activity in the administration. It's no small task being the tent manager of the Mughals. And the kind of money that was involved in all of this, in this entourage. So this is quite revealing, because we, in our museums, as a museum person, when we tell the history of civilization, we're so focused on built architecture, and we can only tell the history of civilization through brick and stone and say this is the symbol of urbanization and we look at Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. But honestly, what about these urban situations, which must have been so much older and and contained people for so much longer and so many more people in the history of civilization? So should cities only be studied on the basis of the brick and mortar that survives? Or is there a parallel history of urbanization and history of cities, which are museums, and we don't know how to excavate and we don't know how to tell those histories? And so that becomes a really important theoretical intervention that this volume tries to make. Now, how did these cities work? So a tent that is made out of red velvet baffled me, because I said, that's really extravagant, right? I mean, this is Hindustan, and they're traveling through Registan and the Thar, and they're coming into Jaipur, and this was found in, as I said, the Tosha Khana of Jaipur. And I said, how much dust did velvet soak up? And really, how do they keep this tent clean? And how do they maintain these tented cities? And really, how do you live in these, practically, how do you live in these tented cities? And so it was interesting to look at this and then look at what importance carpets and daris had. And how do you make such a tented city, and the thousands of carpets that were needed constantly to keep the ground dust down, and what kinds of hand-woven textiles were going to be needed. So when do you need flat weaves, and where do you need a weave with a pile? And what kind of materials you're going to use. And so this opens up a different and a very large scale of the industrial activity that is going on in terms of weaving histories of India, and the kind of consumption of carpets that are needed in these spaces. The central enclosure is probably the one that is the highest, where the palace was, where the court, where the king sat, and that might explain the different sizes of these tented panels. And indeed, we have found some which have leather battens at the back and sockets for keeping the bamboo poles and the ropes with which they would have been tied. And so here we can see a corner of a tent. And on the background, I've given you slides, pictures of the kind of chicks that were being used in these palaces. And the chicks themselves are decorated. So when you're thinking about a building, you're also thinking about the ventilation and the cross ventilation and the screens that are being used. And these chicks are all sort of covered with fabric, with thread, and they're turned into patterns rather like kilims would be. And you see this extension. And then we think about the interiors of these tents. Now, as I was saying, velvet for an exterior, that seems a bit sort of extravagant. And how does that work? And well, the Mughals had even more extravagant brocaded interiors, which they couldn't possibly have used as the exterior, because those are pure gold brocade interiors that they had for the royal palace enclosure. So these were never intended originally to be the interior of a tent, but by the time the Rajputs adopted them, designs and the fashions for the interior design changed, and they were turned into the interior decoration. And so there's a shift from Shah Jahani taste to Jai Singh's time, Savai Jai Singh's time, when they started being used for the interiors. And by the time Abhay Singh of Jodhpur starts using them, they're very much the red interior, like the Lal Dera famous tent of Mehrangarh, which many of you may have seen illustrated in books, and I'll show you some examples of. So we have a shift in the design. I'm showing you some of these slides of what these different tented panels look like. For those of you who know a little bit of architectural history and Mughal painting history, you'll start recognizing that, okay, yeah, that cusped arch is definitely post-Shah Jahani, and that'll help you date the material. And the way the poppy pattern is done, it's not done like a single poppy, which would be the taste of Jahangir a la Ustad Mansoor's paintings, but actually done in a later style with this florid group of flowers, usually 11 blooms that make up a particular cusped arched niche. And looking at the design and the squatness of the patterning, one begins to think of a late Aurangzeb period. But this is speculative. Is it really of how do we date this velvet? How do we date this gold khadi work? How do we date this varak that has been used to make it? Now, this is a very interesting technique. These are not embroidered. These are not cutwork velvet, damask style velvet, which would have a raised pile somewhere and a recessed pile, and then flat weave combinations which were being used in the time of Shah Jahan. These are far more rough and ready. This is a red colored velvet yardage that has been used, and then a glue applied and gold leaf slapped on top. So there's glue that has been put on a block, and that block has been slapped onto the red velvet, and it's just been given a gold leaf, and it's quick and ready. It's got high impact. It dazzles the public as it's seen. It's easily replaced and remanufactured. It's good design. It looks luxurious, but it isn't that expensive and difficult to make compared to what is being made for the interiors of these palaces. And that's far more fragile and more carefully maintained and kept. So in terms of design histories, it takes us to a very different kind of way of thinking about textiles. Abul Fazl writes that first, the Gulal Bar, or the red wall, is erected as a great fence, which has been brought into use by Akbar, the Lord of the World. He describes the office of the tent pitcher and the value of their tents. And he says that the emperor regards this department as an excellent dwelling place, a shelter against heat and cold, protection against rain, and an ornament of the empire. And because he considers its decorativeness as part of the pomp of sovereignty, he accords the care given to the tent manager in the same way, and the tent, as we would give to divine worship. So he thinks it's extremely important. And then he describes exactly how these tents are to be erected. I'll spare you all the details, but I do want to show you what I was trying to say about the interior design. Now, the V&A has a group of these panels. I think they have 6 in total, which are the brocaded pale moss green on a dull gold with pink and red roses. That would have made up the interior of this tented panel, of this tented palace. So you get an idea from these particular panels as to what was originally thought of as the palette for the interior. And this is what I say completely changes 50 years later, 100 years later, when we come into the Rajput environment, where you start seeing the Mehrangarh famous arched interior, which is made of red velvet. Now, as I was saying, these tented encampments where they spent more than 50-60% of their lives were places where important cultural encounters took place. So here you see Prince Khurram meeting the Maharana of Mewar under one of these in a red tented enclosure. It's a painting from the Badshah-Nama, and it's exactly what I was trying to say. When you think about the Mughal family and their Rajput cousins, and all their first cousins are all Rajput cousins, right? And they're all sharing these spaces. So when we're thinking about actually family kinship ties and the cohabitation that is taking place, it's not necessarily happening only in Lahore, Delhi, and Agra. It's happening in these places, which are at Ranthambore, camped outside Mewar, camped outside Aurangabad, camped in the Deccan, where all the cousins are actually cohabiting and meeting with courtly etiquette in spaces like these, where we don't really always know exactly what kind of, how the cities were being designed and redesigned. So Carla Sinipoli did a fantastic study where she estimated that actually the design of the city of Fatehpur Sikri, the great urban achievement of Akbar, is not created because of urban planning sensibilities that have been inherited in built architecture, but actually have come to them from the understanding of planning a city because of the trial and error that has been going on for hundreds of years in making these tented encampments. And so you've done not just a little model, you've done full-scale living models of cities, and that's the city planning technique that is then used for the construction of a place like Fatehpur Sikri. Now, when these cities are on the go, other people come into contact with these cities who don't necessarily have the same courtly etiquette. And they learn about the kind of courtly ceremonial etiquette just as much. If you have to meet the governor of Kohat has certain protocols that Babur needs to have in place. But so does the governor of Kohat need to know about the courtly etiquette that the Central Asian Mongol will have. And he needs to follow certain decorum and protocol, that needs to be followed in a state meeting. Never mind what you see on the television with Trump meeting. Never mind, courtly etiquette and diplomacy rights have to be maintained in some circles at least. For a few centuries, they have been followed. Protocol has been followed on how you meet a head of state and what kind of decorousness needs to be followed. So I think these emulations of sovereignty become quite important, and as we learn about how courtly etiquette is passed on. And this became quite valuable because Zirvat Chaudhry did an interesting study on how the Rajputs began to emulate certain Mughal courtly decorous behavior in their courtly settings. Now, for those, again, art historians, when you look at a Bachahnama page, it's all about hierarchy. Who is on the inner chamber, who has the upper tier, who is beyond the fence. And every painting is all about the hierarchies of division of people in a particular courtly enclosure. So those courtly hierarchies and manners and customs start migrating into new environments. Okay, so let's come to the textile study itself. Let's move beyond this kind of cultural movement. Where was this velvet made? What do we know about the manufacture of velvet? So for a long time, till the 1982 Festival of India in the V&A, it was estimated that this kind of velvet manufacturing could not have happened in India, and this must be Venetian velvet that has been imported and brought into India, and that's what Veronica Murphy of the V&A published based on the textile analysis that was being done at that time. And it's very interesting because since then, Irfan Habib's studies of the manufacturing units for Mughal weaving and craftsmanship that existed in Assam and in UP have now have been coupled with what other textile historians have been doing. And we now know that carpets and velvets had both started being made in South Asia, at Lahore to Assam, at various centers, certainly by the reign of Jahangir, maybe even at the end of the reign of Akbar. And certainly when Shah Jahan is on the throne, the velvets are being made in India, which doesn't mean that they stopped importing Venetian velvet. We know Venetian velvets are being imported into India, but for something as big as this, they probably mobilized their own weavers to make these things. The fascinating thing about it was examining the red dye that was used. The Textile Association of New York did a fabric analysis through chromophotography of this particular textile, this panel which lies at the Metropolitan Museum, which is part of the same tent. And they found that this flashy red tent, where it is faded, tends to look a little crimson. Otherwise, where it's deeper, it tends to look a little carmine. Sometimes it goes into a little brownish surukh-like color. What is the dye that has been used? And typically in India, you would use 3-4 dyes to create this red color. And you could use kusum, but that would give you like a pale orangey yellow, and it wouldn't really give you this luxurious red. Nor do we know how well kusum would take on the silk pile of velvet, on silk, rather than on cotton, which is a different story. And then manjishta or madder, yes, of course, but typically in India for textiles, they would use lark, right, the insect. And they would boil up the lark insects and derive the red dye, which worked beautifully as an insect repellent because termites and other insects like to stay away from the boiled up blood of their cousins. And so it works for good conservation reasons, and that's why a lot of bahis are also made out of that red textile which has been dyed with red, because it's an insect repellent and it's a good dye to use. Now, using lakh in Hindustan was quite a typical dye, but when they did the fabric analysis of this, they found that it was double dipped. And it was dipped a second time in cochineal. And cochineal is a red which comes only from the insects of South America. Now, because this was found, and I date it at about that time of the late 17th century, about the 1670s, 1680s is when this textile would have been made, and it was probably made in Amer, not in Jaipur. And in Amer, they would have we have lots of records of the rangres, the dyers who worked in Amer. And we know that a dyer's workshop had been created by Jaising in Amer. And so what were the fantastic dyes that were being imported into Amer at this time? And South American dyes must have started coming to India and used for this double dipping. Now, we have lots of information. Byron Haman gave me lots of fantastic readings on the movement of cochineal into Europe and the hands of the Turkish seafarers and traders, and how European dyeing, red dye, Europe itself, even for papal robes, had started using the red of cochineal by this time. And so the same red dye, of course, is also being peddled in India, and people in India are also buying this. So we have a whole story about the movement of cochineal across the world from South America to India at this time. It was a very expensive dye. It's not, by the time it comes from South America, it's being sold at a very high rate in India at this time. So we have a very interesting, not just about the migration of people and manners, but we're looking at the mobility of velvet making that goes from a European context till it's naturalized in Lahore and in Assam. We're looking at dyeing, which is happening and using Indian insects as well as South American ones now, which are coming in along with tomatoes and potatoes and marigolds and whatever else are coming into India at this time, forever changing India and Indian culture. So is this color of red coming in. And I think we can also approach this subject from another route, which is looking at the vocabulary that is used in textile studies. So as textile historians, I always tell students and others to always pay attention to the etymologies of words. So what is the word for velvet? And in which language are you going to be able to talk about velvet? And are you going to use makhmal or are you going to use chenille? And where are these two words from? And these aren't Indian words. However, they are Indianized. Similarly, we have in the historical texts, you have a word makhmal-e-badla baf, or brocaded velvet, which is a term that is distinctly Indian and not found in Arabic, because the technique of badla is an Indian word which is being mixed with the technique of makhmal making, which is coming in from wherever else in Central Asia. So now you've got two techniques that the textile manufacturing unit is using, where they're applying badla on makhmal. And so now you've got a mixing of technologies and vocabularies that is taking place, and that vocabulary shift is something that I track in this study, along with the coming of making textiles and carpets which have a pile. India had a very long history of making flat weaves, like kilims and daris, but not making carpets with pile. So when do fabrics with a pile start in South Asia, and which are the units? Where does it start? So I track that in my study, and this is one of the early carpets which is there from the Mughal period, and then velvet carries on. These are some of the interiors of these palaces, which would have had, so just for you to understand what these Mughal interiors were like and how you can date the shift in the interior design. So when the Mughals used their own tented enclosures, they had these kinds of brocaded panels on the interiors. Now, in the Akbari reign, you see the shape of the arch was quite different. Very famous Akbar painting. And you see it's a very simple arch compared to what you are looking at with a cusped or foliated arch. And by the time we look at a Rajput interior in these paintings in Kota, You can see exactly the kind of tent that we are looking at, but now used as the interior design of the palace. So very clear, and they've made a white exterior. So if you see the border, it's got that white exterior now, but it's been printed on cotton rather than. So you've got a whole switch in the tenting material and shift in the history of design. Okay, now apart from being able to date and track these things, I'm going to end by talking about one last point. Since we were talking about etymologies, what is the word for a tented enclosure? So the Mongol word for a tented enclosure is an Urdu, right? The word Urdu means a tented enclosure. And what a beautiful metaphor, right? The word Urdu itself becomes a beautiful language, which is not a pidgin, not a Creole, not a higgledy-piggledy language of just rough words taken from different parts of the world, but an elegant, sophisticated language is born in the area that is the Urdu, where this commingling of cultures takes place. And that itself becomes, the Urdu becomes the word that we use for language, for this language. And we have another word in Hindustan. If you think about two languages in Hindustan, the word for the language itself, for linguistic studies, is so important. There's another language called Saraiki. Kahan ki bhasha? Sarai ki bhasha. Saraiki, right? And so you've got two languages, Saraiki and Urdu, which are born of the idea of mobility and migration, and that lends itself to the name of the language itself. And what can be a better civilizational marker than how much more importance can we give to tents? So I'm going to leave you with that note, and I wanted to say that it takes a lot of research to produce each of these margs. We commission a marg usually 2 years in advance, and it's subsidized and made available in the Indian market for 500 rupees each, although per unit it costs us about 12 to 1300 to produce a single unit. Anyone who works in publishing will tell you that that isn't 500 rupees worth of publishing. But it's done because we are a charitable foundation, and it's done so that people in India can get access to images and objects which are lying scattered all over the world, and we can get the leading researchers of the world to collaborate and pull and bring that research and make it available to people within South Asia at this highly subsidized rate. And it requires a lot of collaboration and support for many, many, many people to come together to make each marg happen. And producing 4 in a year is no joke, I can tell you. And Rahul will testify, it's kind of insane at the rate at which we work to be able to produce it. The pictures that come into a particular marg also require resource people to do detailed picture research, because they're not just randomly illustrating an object or a contention. They are actually saying a lot in themselves that the author sometimes doesn't have the word count to be able to say. So the picture is doing the job instead. And I wanted to thank Anamika Pathak and Sue Kaukji, both curators at different museums, who lent their objects, Gursharan and Elvira Sidhu, Praful and Shilpa Shah. I also really wanted to thank Rahul Jain, who has been really helpful and had millions of conversations with me over the many years that I have researched this particular tented township, and my own assistant Avani Sood, who worked with me very closely, and Gyan Prava in Bombay, which first gave me the platform to present this research for the first time. Marg itself does funky things, like designing these things in interesting ways, and doesn't have to cost a lot of money, but it does require a test of one's imagination sometimes. And so we've had fun putting these together. And it takes a great editorial board member like Rahul to be there to help out with this. But I also want to thank Muzaffar Alam, Nancy Adajania, Phyllis Granoff, Cameron Petrie, David Schulman, and Debbie Swallow for the time that they have lent and given of themselves for debating each marg issue and the feedback that we give to our writers. and the entire internal team at Marg. I'm not going to name them, but your names are all up on here on the board. And finally, all our friends and colleagues. I see people here who have helped Marg a lot over the years. Sumant Jayakrishnan is standing at the back. He's a part of this volume. He designs the greatest big fat Indian wedding tents. And how can a Marg on tents be complete without inclusion of the wedding tent? I wanted to thank Jyotendra for being here, because he's been a mentor for all these years in helping me along personally. So thank you very much. Over to you, Rahul. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, it's fine. Okay. Thank you, Naman. Thank you, everyone, for being here. My God, I've listened to you. We've discussed this stuff, but this is so intense that I'm exhausted. I don't know how this audience is going to listen to another talk. But I think what was great about doing this issue with Naman was he brought this sort of deeply rigorous historical perspective. And my concerns as an architect and urban designer was trying to project into what it means for the future. And so what I'm going to really share with you is that research which led to us thinking about this issue in the way we did finally, but also the kind of questions it raises for us to think about as we go into the future. And so really this was about, and this has been an interest, and I think it emerges also as a question in the issue on tents, is challenging the idea of the city as a static and stable entity. We take permanence in a sense as a default in our imagination about cities. And I think Naman brought this up, is why is architecture and the history read through architecture as permanent encoding of memory the only device by which we can memorialize stuff? And so I think in the profession of architecture, we haven't paid enough attention to the design of transitions. We always think in terms of absolute solutions. And this is where architecture gets very easily co-opted and instrumentalized in that imaginary. And so therefore the provocation is, are we making permanent solutions for often temporary problems? We tend to, for example, in the United States, there are about 2,000 abandoned malls because Amazon has changed the paradigm completely. Those resources were enormous. Can we not think in temporal terms, which might make us more sustainable in our existence on the planet? These statistics, I think, for the next generation of architects is startling, because if you think about it, in 25 years, 3 billion people are going to live in what we call roughly informal settlements. The IDB Bank right now has projected with hard data that 55 million people actually live in tents on this planet, and about 300 million use temporal and ephemeral landscapes even for their existence. And these numbers are only growing. This is a wonderful diagram that actually a colleague of mine, who was the chief architect of the city of Barcelona made, where he basically, tells us how any city is made out of 3 moves: urbanization, plot division, and buildings. A monarch decides to settle a city, whether it's starting with a camp or otherwise. Plots are divided, and private enterprises engaged, people are sold plots, and people build buildings. And that's what happened in the traditional city. In the garden city development during industrialization in the West, you had urban planning, that is urbanization, and plot division collapse, which means someone developed property and then sold you a plot to build. In housing estates, which is what we see today as gated communities or around the world, these 3 aspects collapse, and you get a key, because urbanization, plot division, buildings is done by one person, and then you get a particular kind of environment. For the future, and what we roughly call informal housing, for me personally, informal is not the correct word, and we're searching for other words. this gets reversed. Buildings happen first. Then some politician for votes begins to ratify plots. And then if they're lucky over time, what happens is infrastructure comes in the process of urbanization. So it's completely turned on its head. And I think in this condition, thinking of transitions, thinking of the ephemeral, thinking of tense as a device, as an instrument, could be very useful as we, as architects, imagine the future. If you really think about it, towns grew historically as conduits to organize the surplus from the countryside. You had markets. The markets were temporary. They happened twice a week, once a month, etc. As those markets began to prosper, when the surplus from the rural increased, merchants emerged. Then they began to camp in the city or in the settlement wherever the markets were happening. I think the ultimate of that was the city beautiful Vienna, right, where it became a static entity. You had zoning, the rich lived somewhere, concerts were held somewhere else, and that was the beginning of cities, or that trajectory. But otherwise cities didn't exist. It was just a tool to manage the surplus from the countryside. And there was a coexistence always of the temporary and the permanent. And so this aspiration for the permanent and the notion of the permanence of the temporary, I think it's worth paying attention to. And of course, in historic records, paintings, you always see this. You see the town emerging in the backdrop, but it's propelled by the mechanism of the market that is organizing the surplus from the countryside, right? And that whole equation is blurring, and I'll end this presentation with raising some provocations for that. This is Afghanistan, 1800s, what Naman has already spoken about, how camps were, these were settlements that were organized, tested, or people just moved along. They had a kind of expiration date, so to speak, sometimes months, sometimes years. And this wonderful image of Fatehpur Sikri, and of course there's one interpretation which talks about as an imagined tented town translated into stone and abandoned. And so it's no different from the diagram I showed you before this. So really, I think in the practice of at least the profession I'm engaged with, and this was the conversation I think that propelled many ideas for this issue, was that yes, we organize the world in binaries. It's a very good way to organize the world, but really design, if you think projectively of the future, it's about blurring these, right? It's about reconciling what is otherwise contestations articulated through these binaries. And again, I think the tent provoked us to think about the static or the permanent city versus what is the ephemeral, the temporal, and therefore the cities on the move, even as a title. My own work, I began framing this theoretically by calling the Indian city the kinetic city, a city that is not really perceived always or only by architecture or cohesive urban design, which we all despair about, but by spaces really that hold associative values and are supportive of lives. So it's patterns of occupation that determine the form and perception, I believe, of the Indian or the South Asian city. And it's an indigenous urbanism which has its own very particular local logic. And this is what this essay and book has tried to articulate. And it's not necessarily the city of the poor as we impulsively begin to correlate it with, and most images seem to suggest that when we talk about informality, etc. But rather, it's really about the temporal articulation and occupation of space that not only creates a much richer sensibility of spatial occupation, but also suggests how spatial limits are expanded to include formerly unimagined uses in very dense urban conditions. So whether it's our temporary markets, whether it's ways we articulate our wedding spaces on Maidans, it's about this elasticity that is determining. And it was very much this sort of research that in our conversations began to inform how we might instrumentalize, or at least propose that you could instrumentalize tents, emblematically, so to speak, as also an instrument. And so here, architecture is not the spectacle of the city. And this is an image from Mumbai for the Ganesh Chaturthi celebrations. And what you have on the other side is what I call the landscape of impatient capital. These are cities that are made and driven by the impatience of capital, and cities, often autocracies, where capital is allowed to land frictionless. Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Shanghai, etc., manifests itself into what I call rather brittle urban form. It is not about the associative values people have. Now, I don't think it's an argument for one or the other. It's again about blurring these binaries. And that's what for me is wonderful about this image, where architecture as a background is as critical as the temporality of that spectacle. And here, immersion, in the case of the Ganesh festival, becomes a metaphor for the spectacle of the city, because as the clay idol dissolves in the water of the bay, the spectacle comes to a close. There are no static or permanent mechanisms to encode this spectacle. Here, the memory of the city itself is an enacted process. It's a temporal moment, as opposed to buildings that contain public memory as static and permanent entities. The city and its architecture actually, they don't even mean, or they don't even contain the same meaning. Within the kinetic city, at least as I describe it, meanings are not stable. Spaces get consumed, reinterpreted, recycled. The kinetic city recycles the images of the static city to create new spectacles. And this is an example of what I sort of meant by how these binaries begin to dissolve. And the Christmas market in European cities is an example of this. They camp for a month, etc. And this is this opposition, or this sort of dichotomy seemingly, but it is synergistic in many ways because of its temporal dimension. And these tents create a whole amazing landscape. And this was all in Basel, which I happened to be before I came to study the Kumbh Mela, which I'm going to talk about. And it was amazing. From these tented, stretched cloth, I arrived, for 24 hours later in the Kumbh Mela to see different manifestations of this. And the Kumbh Mela became a study which I think opened up many directions, at least for me in my research, to look at the ephemeral more seriously, tents being an extension or an instrument within that sort of landscape. And we took the idea of the kinetic and morphed it into ephemeral, and took the idea of city, the kinetic city, and made it ephemeral urbanism. And this was a very interesting project which was done at Harvard University across 7 schools. It was truly interdisciplinary to study this tented city. The Kumbh Mela had been studied through many lenses. Raghuveer Singh did one of the early books among his series of books, which was for me very seminal in understanding this. But the lenses that have been used are through divinity studies or through anthropology or gender studies. No one I understood had studied it as a form of urbanism, an ephemeral megacity, a city that had its own logic. And it has all the attributes of an existing city, which was what was wonderful. And of course, this is a whole lecture in itself. I won't go into it. I'll just allude to the question of tents, because here, essentially, as you all know, it's a Hindu festival. It just got over. The numbers are all very bizarre. We studied this in the last cycle, and there weren't as many VVIPs there. So we had a lot of peace for the 10 or 12 days we spent there. We had access to a lot of conversations with people who organize it. And really our intent was to study the Kumbh Mela as a form of urbanism. And the schools range from the School of Public Health, divinity, business, engineering, fine arts, design. What was interesting in terms of it being an interdisciplinary project was that no discipline had the confidence to claim an understanding of the logic behind it. Actually, the School of Divinity were probably the most equipped because they could understand the processes, the rhythms that the rituals carried. But even the architects and urban designers were completely at bay, which was very, very interesting. Now, there were many very interesting aspects of studying the Kumbh, but I'm just going to talk about. One, governance is very interesting. Someone should look at it because even governance there is ephemeral and temporal in that the hierarchies shift as you approach the festival, which would be a great lesson for us dealing with climate change and the kind of emergencies that we are dealing with today. But it, like I said, has the attributes of a city. It has medical facilities, fire stations, probably more fire stations than even Mumbai has. It was the cleanest Indian city I lived in for 2 weeks. So it's a wonderfully efficient space. At least it was 12 years ago. I understand there were other problems this time. But really for us to study how this emerges from a river that recedes, the sandbanks emerge, and how does one create a city that touches the ground very lightly? There are no foundations. And that's an image that we took in October when the water was yet in the river, and on the 14th of January that image was taken where a whole city had emerged. It's not a pop-up city as people describe it. It's a formal, deliberate state operation. So it has to be taken and looked at from that perspective, and I think the learnings therefore become much more relevant. A grid is employed, so it's very rational. It's very robust because every road on that grid goes across as a pontoon bridge. These are images that Dinesh Mehta took, which we've carried in the issue. We were this was a time when cell phones, this was the first Kumbh Mela where cell phones were used, because 24 years ago there weren't cell phones. And of course the laws didn't allow us to use a drone, but the law school students looked at the laws for us and they found there was nothing that stopped him from mounting a camera on a kite. So these are images that are taken using a kite, a large kite, because there was no law for it. The only problem was that we flew the first kite on the 14th of Jan, forgetting it's Sankranti, so it was cut in like 5 minutes, and we had to go reclaim it, which was an interesting learning. But these are all kite images. But you see how the grid goes. It's a completely tented city. And that's what's interesting. This entire city above the ground is made out of 5 materials: 8-foot tall bamboo, screws or nails, rope or string, and skinning materials that are either corrugated metal or textiles or plastic, a skinning material. It is a kit of parts, which is what allows it to be assembled so quickly, but also disassembled in 2 weeks. And so that is the agility. And here you see from a single family tent to a large temple to house 200 people, it's the same materials, but deployed in different ways. So the whole city is a tented city, which is fascinating. And it gets erected to these scales, wrapped over. These are temples, community halls, and it's quite amazing how it is deployed systematically as a system, really, and it is a tented city, and that's why it's a big part of this issue, but interpreted and projected in different ways from what we did within mapping the ephemeral megacity as a book. And as you know, these were images we took a week later. Only the mats remain, and the river comes, and no memory is left because it's erased. It's an enacted process that is not encoded as memory on this. So then we expanded this as research into what we call ephemeral urbanism, because, the feedback we got within an academic context at least was that, okay, you have a religious festival which is single-minded because it's a city with a single purpose. Cities around the world are contested, and I think all the problems we find in city comes because we can't spatially resolve contestations, whether it's between the rich and the poor or other aspirations. The Kumbh Mela has a single aspiration. It's a Hindu Congress, and therefore it does well. So how does one take that rubric and expand it? And so we began to interrogate the idea of this category, and this is the book that came out of it. It's called Does Permanence Matter? And it is a book now, and I'm just going to quote Richard Sennett, who is a well-known sociologist and a commentator who wrote the preface for the book. And he said, "This project is an exploration of a reality which at once very old and entirely new. Human settlements have always included temporary settlements like the camp of an army, which Naman spoke about, which appears and disappears in a few days, or the mobile tents and household possessions of hunter-gatherers at the very dawn of human social life. The common assumption about civilization is that in time, stone should come to replace fabric, that human settlements should become ever more solid in material and structure, the longer they endure. Today, we can no longer make that assumption. because in part this is due to mobile phones and other advanced technologies in which the pixel comes to replace stone. Cities are being reshaped around mobile communicative spaces rather than fixed physical form. As well as this, the city is becoming less fixed in ways that remain physical in nature. And this was his observation, and it's interesting because it resonates many kind of ways that Naman actually articulated the evolution, in a sense, of tented settlements, etc. Now, this also has a dark side, it has a light side. Like I said, there are 30 to 40, 55 million people, well, 55 million people in tented, according to IDB Bank, but it's about 30 to 40 million people with a 5-year-old statistic that live in refugee camps. So these are enormous numbers which are changing the way human settlements will actually be seen in the future. So the taxonomy we came up with was religion, celebration, transaction, extraction, disaster, military, refuge. And really this was a very, very important decision not to universalize the category of ephemeral urbanism. Like we do with informality, we say informal settlements. The favelas in Rio have a completely different DNA, logic, physical manifestation than the slums in Mumbai, for example. But we put them in, and that is not useful for us who have to act as designers, planners, urban designers, scholars, to be able to understand but also intervene in improving them. And so each of these in this taxonomy have a completely different rhythm. They have different expiration dates. They have different temporal cycles. Some are about the bright side of humanity, some are about the dark side of humanity. And therefore, contestations play themselves out differently. I'm just going to show you an example of what this research does. So this is the taxonomy. We looked at time durations for all of these sorts of settlements. We looked at mapping where they exist on the planet. And, you know, here in the different colors, which you can't read, tell you what are for religion, what are for disaster. But this is a very extensive mapping of what are ephemeral landscapes that are really tented communities, essentially, just to make a case for the relevance of an issue like this. So in the case of transactions, I'll just show you some examples very quickly. These are markets. These are markets in Mexico City where 50,000 vendors on the weekends actually set up a market, which is reversed by Monday morning. And the parking lots get instrumentalized, in a sense, for these temporal landscapes. And these are some of the figures. The just statistics are mind-boggling, 1,400 markets. And then again, how they exist around the world. Some exist all through the year, some come on weekends. What are the different rhythms? What are the ways that one can draw these observations into the vocabulary of urban planning? And how does one create a set of metrics that we can, as urban planners and urban designers, which we've ignored completely. We've put everything into a category of slums or the informal, and planners don't know how to deal with it. They then imagine how, through absolute solutions, they become housing, which is the SRA scheme in Mumbai, for example. But if one can actually infect the debate of urban design and urban planning with these forms and imaginaries of temporality, but bring them into the metrics of what urban designers and architects look at, then I think there's some hope in the way we can address these issues, whether through pedagogy or through practice. And so this book documents a lot of this, describes them, tells you where it's located, maps them on Google Map histories to see how they're erected, actually makes drawings of what are the sizes of the tents. This is the Rue Lump in Thailand, where this track, the market sort of actually accommodates itself on the track, and the tents open and close depending on when the train comes and goes to accommodate the train. So these are tents that are dynamic. And so here in this research, we've actually put the metrics of all of this so people can actually draw them, and actually bring it into the vocabulary of urban design and planning. And we've done the same for all the taxonomy, all the components of the taxonomy. And here's just for refuge, looking at refugee camps. And you see, some of them go for decades. It's becoming the new permanent in a way. And just mapping and understanding that, I think, opens up space within at least our profession and discipline to discuss this. So these are the descriptions, but also through Google, we've made AutoCAD drawings so you can calculate density, lengths of road, lengths of drainage, drainage, and actually bring it into the discussion of urban planning in a more kind of substantial way. So tents really are the most enduring emblem, I believe, of human settlements, and that's what was very exciting. I'm not going to go into some of this because Naman has talked about it, which is the contents of the issues, of the issue itself, but I'm just going to highlight a few things. We've also included refugee camps. We've looked at camps and spaces of protest and how settlements are articulated to give identity. We've looked at tents as complements to buildings. This is a very interesting sketch that Charles Correa had made in the late 70s, where he had talked about how shamianas were used to cover courtyards to respond to climatic needs. So in the winter, for example, they let the sun heat up the courtyard, and at sundown a shamiana was stretched so the hot air could stay in, and that was reversed in the winter. And that's why when you look at drawings, miniature paintings, the textile is always a complement to the buildings, and it is the soft aspect of it, but it is an extension. And of course, this is even relevant today. This is a project we've done for a library at Sept University, where we actually designed tents which are used in summer to complement the building. The building was designed to make this part of it in a way that shaded space could be used in the Ahmedabad heat. So it is about lightness, it's about agility, it's about adaptability, and it is the ephemeral. And so therefore the Bedouin tents, for example, these are incredibly inspiring, because in the same way as the governor took the Mughal tents, the person who erected the Bedouin tent was the wise man or woman in the tribe, because these are the geometries of these are extendable. They respond to the dunes, they respond to the wind direction, they respond to the sun, and they take on different forms every time they are moved to a different location. And so it's a complex geometry which has to be understood, and how it's organized as social space. They're just incredibly beautiful dimensions. Fry Otto's work for the Munich, his tensile structures come from these inspirations, very much from these inspirations, and you could argue that these are reversible, although this has lasted for a long time. And if you think about it, Olympics are a real albatross around the necks of cities, because they cost a lot, they can never be used effectively unless, like London, they decide to reverse some of it. And actually the Olympic company, inspired by the committee, inspired by circuses, should have a traveling show. They should have inflatable structures, they should have tented structures that move with the Olympic committee. They go and camp like the circus used to do. That would be the sustainable way to do it. And so there are many, the Hajj terminal designed by SOM is another fantastic example, which not only evokes the old images of the tents, which people would have used 40 years or 50 years ago, but it actually now is used for a contemporary purpose. Fry Otto, Shigeru Ban, there are many architects who are inspired by these structures and the agility, but also the lightness of it. Naman spoke about this one, the cover image that we have. It's actually a study by a PhD student at Harvard who was looking at markets in Dhaka. And these are markets in Dhaka which are just mind-boggling in the way they're organized, again, on a temporal scale. I mean, they're not only beautiful, but they are rational, on a grid, get erected, de-erected, and serve. I mean, they actually serve as massive forms of infrastructure. We would land up otherwise making huge markets as permanent structures, and that's the question: does permanence actually matter? This is in Basel on the Novartis campus. This is a building by Frank Gehry, and this has really amazing scientists who work on cutting-edge pharmaceutical stuff. They occupy the Frank Gehry building, but every summer they build their own little tented structure where they eat lunch. They refuse to eat in the Frank Gehry cafeteria. There's a level of comfort for them because it alludes to a past, or maybe to the Christmas markets. But these sort of counterpoints, and I think the point I'm really trying to make is, do we polarize this, or can we embrace the temporal, the tent, the textile, the fabric, light, the agility, memories that trigger other ideas as part of our architectural imaginary, rather than setting them up as binaries, because these extensions could not only be sustainable, economical, but good for the planet. a wedding tent in Dubai, in this landscape of impatient capital. Again, the notion and the impulse to adorn in a way that is meaningful for cultural spatial practices is a great example. And I just want to sort of end this part, and I'll take just 2 more minutes with this inclusion that Naman and I think we ended the issue more or less with. This is a concrete tent which was built by Dar for the Sharjah Biennale. I was lucky to visit it, and when I brought it to Naman's notice, we both just sort of had to include it. It was done by Dar, which is an art practice, and they call it permanent temporariness. It's in the Al Madam village, which is about a 2-hour drive from Sharjah. And it's a village which had modern housing, which the government had built in a way to put an end to nomadic tribes and to make them less mobile and more settled. Of course, that whole settlement of modern housing was abandoned. And so what they did as a commentary, and it's a modern architecture preservation project, where they created a tent using fabric but poured it in concrete, so it's permanent. And it's a hybrid between a mobile tent and a modern home, and that was what the art installation was about. And it's meant to heighten the paradoxes between the binaries of the soft and the hard, the temporary and the permanent, movement and stillness, dislocation and relocation. And in their words, Alessandro and Sandy, who are the 2 artists, they said permanent temporariness is a condition of dislocation and relocation caused by political, economic, and environmental conditions, depriving people to act and engage with the present, either stuck in a nostalgia of the past, a lost past, or thinking about an idealized future. The present seems inaccessible and suspended, albeit temporarily. And that is the lives of many millions of people on this planet, and this was a commentary on it. And in it is, you sit in the tent in a kind of meditative position, and what you have is a recording which spells out the names of the children who've been killed in the Gaza war. So it's a very powerful installation which is not only a commentary on historic preservation, because what it is, it's understanding a preservation project not as an instrument of permanency, but as a method of re-narrating a story. Thus, this intervention as a permanent set of temporariness on a heritage site. In dialogue with the modernist ruins of the housing, it's a new layer that they bring as a provocation for how we can look at migrant populations and their conditions. And over time, they intend it will be taken over by the dunes. So it's a very poetic installation which captures emblematically many of the issues that we are trying to reconcile in this. So what are the research questions? I'm just going to take 2 minutes to end. It's raising questions, and having done this issue and in discussions with Naman, what is the notion of uncertainty? We are all dealing with it, especially now in the light of climate change. And how do we nuance uncertainty on a temporal scale? And if you think about temporality, it becomes much more manageable to think about uncertainty. And linked to that is the life cycle of materials, because we always say, oh, my grandfather built that building to last for 500 years. There's an assumption that that permanence and encoding that much energy in the permanence of materials is a good thing. Now, I think as human beings, we need permanence. So it's not a matter of this or that, but it's a matter of calibrating that balance. We don't need to make everything permanent in that imaginary. Embedding temporality in our disciplinary thinking as architects, urban designers, and theorizing permanence in temporality for the idea of the home. Because the home, in all these debates, when it comes to the home, that's where we strive for permanence more than anything else. And what does that mean? I don't have the answers. I'm just posing these as questions. And so therefore, the installation by Dar was, I think, for me, very poetic, because it brings to the conversation the notion of permanent temporariness. And so therefore, I think, just to end with a piece of current research, is to say that what does architecture mean in a time of flux? And what even is urban? If you look at the nightlights as a proxy for what human settlements or the form settlements are taking in the context of India or South Asia, it doesn't let you read cities very clearly. in India, as many of you know, there are three criteria for something to become a town and to get a municipality, get the infrastructure, etc. It is that it must be a settlement that has a population of 5,000 people, it has a density of 400 people per square kilometer, and bizarrely, very bizarrely, it must have 75% of the male population in non-agricultural employment. Now that's an impossibility in India, but that's where this blur has occurred. There is no rural, urban, that imagination is gone. We have to get over it. So when you look at maps the government produced, this is all on the last census because we haven't done a census, so it keeps my research relevant for a few more months, maybe a year, is that we have about 7,523 settlements, and we see them as big and small circles, right? That is how our imagination of cities is and how they are. Now, what we did as part of this research with students is took each one of these criteria and at the village level spatialized it to see what does it mean when you have 500,000 people per settlement or 400 people per square kilometers density, and what does it mean when 75% of the folks are. So this is what the reading does. So when you take a population of 5,000 people, that's what urban India looks like. The small and big circles disappear. The proxy of the night lights is more accurate. If you take the density question, we have the world's biggest megacity that goes from Kashmir to Calcutta. It's 300 million people who live in the Indo-Gangetic Plain. The densities go way over 400 people. Greater Houston in America is 240 people per square kilometer. Uttar Pradesh and the Indo-Gangetic, the densities are bizarrely high. So it's the world's bigger megacity. And of course, Kerala is constant in all of this because there the rural-urban continuum has disappeared many, many decades ago because of their policies, cultural practices, etc., the backwaters as geography. Now, if you take the criteria of 75% of the male population in non-agricultural, the megacity just disappears completely. So that's the megacity, but when you put the criteria of 75% of the male population, which is very bizarre, Kerala yet stays that way. So the point I'm making is these are completely different readings of the urban. And each one of these readings would require urban designers, urban planners, architects, citizens to react completely differently in our urban imaginary. So for example, housing. Let's take housing. We've got obsessed with this metric of 1 BHK, 2 BHK, 3 BHK. The whole world is divided into these BHKs, right? That assumes a nuclear family. It doesn't account for the flux that occurs. We should be talking about YMCA type dharamshalas. That would solve a lot of the problems of slums and squatter settlements because that is the demand. But unless you understand how urban India is panning out, you cannot have that imaginary for housing, among many other things. I'm just giving you an example. And that's why we had that whole reverse migration of people walking back to that Indo-Gangetic Plain, which will also be the most susceptible with climate change, where 300 million people could potentially be displaced over a few decades, right? So the research is showing that really the urban attention should be paid to what we are calling transitioning settlements. There are about 15,000 settlements that have all the characteristics of an urban settlement. They have populations of over 100,000 people sometimes 200,000 people, but they're yet classified as villages because they don't meet the criteria, which means they're run by a panchayat, they don't have a municipality, and they don't have the infra. That's the urban time bomb India is sitting on. And I believe that, I think looking at tense, looking at the notion of temporality, the ephemeral, is not the solution, but it could be a very critical instrument that we bring to our conversations to make this transition that urban India is making. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we've exhausted the time that we were allocated. We're supposed to finish in 5 minutes, but we've done it exactly within time. Very, very rich conversation, presentation, Rahul, thank you. Lots to think about in terms of the symbiotic relationship between the permanent or the pakka and the impermanent and kacha. They seem to sort of really work in tandem. It's not a way of thinking of one versus another, as you very nicely said, but it's about the complementarity of them. And I think along with that comes an acceptance that we are both trying to talk about at a psychological level which is about an acceptance of impermanence. And acceptance of the idea of impermanence being intrinsic to how we have to think, and the uncertainty even in what, as you said, in the very idea of what is home. Home itself has to be, we have to grow up thinking about it as an uncertain commodity. And that's a rather challenging idea for many, because it goes right to the heart of the nation state as well. Because what do you consider national then, if that is all itself something that you lay in question? So super. Thanks very much. This has turned into a JNU debate after all. But if anyone else has questions in the audience, I'd be happy to try and address. Do we have a mic? Or
We can take 2 or 3.
yeah, sure.
I don't have a question, but want to add a small comment. In late 1930s, the French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, he came to India, and the only time he came, and he came via road and rail. So he was crossing from Europe to several Islamic countries. I'm saying Islamic reference to architecture. He came, he went to Iran, he went to Turkey, and then via Afghanistan, he entered India. And when he came to Delhi, he saw Mughal architecture here, and he writes extraordinary 3 pages on his observation of difference between what he saw in these Islamic regions, and then he came to Delhi. Now, very interestingly, he says that Indian Mughal and other Islamic architecture in Delhi was sort of translation of soft material into hard material. So he says that all the textile related things like frills and jalis and things like that had that kind of feeling in Islamic architecture in Delhi. And then he talks about added thing, like what you said, Charles Correa, that is, all of them had the big iron rings to which were attached certain additional elements in textile. That but in more than that, he says, and that one has to look at, because we have been studying Islamic architecture all the time, historically, this, that, comparative. But he brings a very interesting idea of this soft material thing that we need to examine. He doesn't talk only about this added soft material, but he talks about the architecture itself being a translation of soft material. And that, I think, from that angle, a study could be done. Second comment, can I make some more?
Yeah.
Okay. Second thing is an observation talking about migratory communities and their temporary structures. If you go to Thar Desert, go to Kutch, go to Sindh, go to Barmer, Jaisalmer, whole region, these are homes of several migratory communities. So Rabaris, for example, camel herders.
Yeah.
Then there are Bharwars, who are sheep herders. Then Charans, who are cow herders and things. Now they all have those roots you mentioned that Monisha's, those roots are very in detail studied by a German historian called Sigrid von Westphal Hellbusch. She did studies of all the 3 or 4 migratory communities and talked about the roots. And it's very interesting because these roots that you were talking about, that they took part of half of the year, those roots she has tracked. So that's one. But lastly, just small point about the same thing, that the migratory communities, their housing was very temporary, tent-like and things like that, compared to settled farmers. Their houses were, But interestingly, the migratory communities' clothing was unstitched, so unstructured. Whereas when you talk of settled farmers, their housing was structured and solid. Now the clothing also was that the stitched clothing was worn by stitched clothing was worn by farmers, and loose
Unstitched by
wrap around and things like that. When Charans, a community who are buffalo and cow herders, they migrated to Gir forest area, and there they settled down and became farmers. Interestingly, that they began to wear, like the neighboring farmers, stitched garments, but in memory of their earlier migratory days, they started to do a wrap around, not to forget their original clothing.
Right.
So these are all very interesting things related to.
Thank you. Yeah. Can we pass the mic here, please?
Kirit Parikh is my name. I have just one question. Do you know of any urban plan which sort of meets this requirement of evolution, dynamic changes, and changing population, changing requirements,
The Kumbh Mela plan, that's the only No, but no, it's a
that
good
only
question.
one.
Yeah.
Kumbh Mela had only one objective.
Yeah. No, so
A city
yeah,
or urban area has many multiple objectives.
Yeah, no, and so no, that's I think where the change in the conversation is to come, and I believe it will not come politically. It will not come from our community. It will come from the crisis of climate change related phenomena, where I think we are going to be forced to, in the future, and this is within the academy, it's happening in a big way. In Europe, it's beginning to become a conversation that's infecting the debate, where you begin to design natural systems and we put cities in the interstitial space rather than the other way around that we've historically done. And how that so the challenge is, and that's why I emphasize the notion of designing transitions, is see, none of this can happen overnight, right? So that's why in Manhattan they're spending billions to buffer all that real estate rather than doing managed retreat, because those are assets, right? So how one designs these transitions that one can manage these retreats with climate change will force us to think more innovatively about this. I believe. I mean, this is an open question.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we're going to have to really start thinking about these issues in a more actively across society, because there's going to be no alternative as more and more cities go underwater. And indeed, that is going to be the only way. It's going to be the force of climate change that's going to make us think differently. I better draw the evening to a close. Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you for your support.